Welcome to the Curious Realm.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our continuing coverage of the International Association of Near-Death Studies Conference 2022 here in Salt Lake City. We have with us Johanna Lunn. She is the writer and director of the Death and Dreaming DVD, as well as a series of movies about death.
That's right. In the Realm of Death and Dreaming is the first of a trilogy of films from the When You Die Project that asks the question, does consciousness continue after death?
Well, and that is really the big, much like UFOs in the media was the concept behind this year's MUFON conference, that is really the idea behind this year's IANDS conference. We had the big Bigelow Institute come in earlier today and give out their grant proposal presentation about if you are out there and researching this, they are actively giving grants to people to prove the existence of intelligence and consciousness after death.
Definitely a bold thing, and I have to say this: the When You Die Project really started 8 years ago and counting. And as a filmmaker, I thought, well, this will be, 2.5 years down and dirty, make one film. And it was a film I wanted to make for a lot of personal reasons. But then as I started doing the research, it was like, oh, there is so much more to this question. And that's how it became a trilogy. And there's a epilogue in the wings, and a rich website and a podcast and all kinds of resources, because it is so much more than we think. And think, well, I'm like I am right now, and then you die. Or maybe you've had some kind of transcendent experiences or glimpses, or maybe even a near-death experience, and you go, oh, that's a little bit more. But what I really appreciated about the Bigelow competition was that 8 years ago, I would have loved all those papers to read. It wasn't so easy to find all this material.
Well, and let's get into that real quick. Number one, what was it that you said it was a personal reason, if you're willing to share? What was it that brought you to want to make this course of movie to begin with? Because it's one thing to already be involved in paranormal or something like that, have a penchant for it, what have you. But that wasn't necessarily the case with you.
Well, not particularly. I guess I should say that as a human being, I've always been interested in all of that kind of stuff, all the paranormal stuff, all the, as a young girl at slumber parties, we had Ouija boards and all that stuff.
As a filmmaker.
But as a filmmaker, and my motivation for this, it really was that at a young age, there were a number of significant deaths in my life in less than 3 years.
Yeah.
So I lost my mother, my best friend, who was like, sister, and then I was in a car accident and held an old dairy farmer in my arms while he died, and I thrust into this deep grief journey, and at that time no one talked about death. It wasn't in polite society. We, since World War II, we did everything possible to push death out of our homes, even,
literally
right?
out of our homes.
Yeah, the parlor became the living room, and then you put the dead bodies in a funeral parlor, right? Yeah. All of that, the language and everything changed so that birth and death just didn't happen at home anymore. So those two great portals of a human life, where all kinds of interesting things that can challenge what it means to be human happen, were no longer happening at home or talked about or related to. So, when all these deaths happened to me, it's like people just didn't want me around. They had no idea how to talk to me.
Sure.
I had the plague.
You were the elephant in the room.
I absolutely was.
And a lot of this show, even whenever I was talking to you earlier, the whole concept behind this show originally was conversations that people don't like having.
Yeah.
Because I think that is really a big part of our society, and a big part of where our society has kind of split and gone awry, because at one point we had this really beautiful concept. Let's just take death, for instance. We had a beautiful familial concept of death when you go back to pre-1920s America, really before refrigeration.
Exactly.
Which I think is there was a great PBS special that was put out a few years ago about home death and about the whole concept behind home burial and the rebirth of the home burial movement.
That's right.
And about how integral the concept of grieving and mourning was to those who were left behind.
Yeah.
And how having that person, I myself come from a Cajun upbringing where when I was a kid, we still had a traditional wake. We went and we stayed at the funeral home with the body. Like me and my cousins joke about playing tag in the funeral home and getting in trouble for playing tag on our overnight stays. You know, like, don't hide near the bodies. Things like that. I mean, horrifying situations, but at the same time, something that in that horrible moment as a family that to this day we laugh about.
Right. That's right.
To this day, it's an endearing memory to us about the loss of a loved one. And I think that is what we have turned this concept of death and moving on into the next state into such a sterile and medical association.
That's right. That's right. And so the birth of the When You Die Project was because I wanted to normalize that conversation and bring death back into life, because the story you just told of playing mischief in the funeral home and all that, that's life, right? Birth, death, life, all there at once. You know, you lose someone, it's sad and we grieve, but it doesn't mean that there aren't moments that have a lot of humor to them.
Absolutely.
Right there, maybe at the funeral or, you know, wherever. There's always humor. There's always life happening.
Yeah.
And so to move it away and say, oh, that's just so horrible, we're not going to talk about it. It sucks the life right out of the, you know, the air right out of the room.
Sure.
And in fact, there was a study that was done in the UK that looked at people who had grown up in a home where talking about death was not a taboo subject, just normal. And people who were brought up where it was never discussed, it was definitely taboo. The people who grew up in a home where death wasn't a big boogeyman in the closet were funnier than people who grew up without death in their life.
Repressed from
exactly.
it. Yeah, well, because it really is one of those, like, you got to know how to laugh.
Exactly.
And I remember my grandfather, I, to this day, am one of those people that I am a clumsy individual. I make jokes all the time. I have size 16 feet. If you have a trip hazard, I will find it. But he used to joke around with me about the size of my feet when I was a kid. And I remember him pulling me aside and telling me one day, like, you know, I joke with you like that because I love you, right? Like, I know you're not going to scratch my ceiling with your feet. I know you're not. It's just you're growing fast, boy. But still, that to me is one of the most endearing memories of my grandfather, is him funly poking fun at the size of my feet, which were unnaturally large for my Cajun, short, under 6 foot family. So, yeah, and it is different. I've even noticed that difference on both sides of my family, between my Cajun family, who has that background of that healthy background of wake, and being there and being there in transition for everybody. And my father's side of the family, who is not that way. They don't talk about such things. It's not what you talk about. Pretty sure Bama just played. Can't we talk about Bama? You know? So now, while making these series of movies, go ahead.
Actually, this is something that you said, you know, that when you're able to wake someone and be there with it, you're also setting yourself up for healthy grieving.
That's right.
Right? So you're not going to have repressed memories that are terrifying to you, but it's really, I think, the whole issue for me around understanding both consciousness continuing after death or not, or how we grieve, or all of that. It's about how to be a healthy human being and to embrace our humanity.
Well,
right?
That's
That's what it's really all about for me.
Well, and we, especially in the Western Hemisphere, are really, really hung up on this concept of death and about it being a finality.
Right.
And about it just being the end.
Right.
Whereas you go to the other 3/4 of the world, not the case, culturally or religiously. It's the fact that this is just a stage of life.
Right.
That you continue. I don't know what you're talking about. Everything ends. So in your exploration of all this data and your making of the movies, was there anything that really steeled you and changed the way that you look at death in your own life?
I hadn't really stopped to think too much about that. I think that for me, it was just unfolding a deeper and deeper perspective on what I intuitively already believed. And to meet researchers and what their issues were around this study, and to meet people who had near-death experiences, or psilocybin researchers who were working with existential fear of dying, and how that was so beneficial for people who, at the end stage of their life, were experiencing pain that they couldn't control with medication.
Yeah.
But one psilocybin trip alleviated their pain and their deep fear of death. And so what is it about transcendence and being human? You know, it was Maslow that had the hierarchy of human experience, and transcendence is definitely a mark of humanity. And what researchers were sort of showing with people that have had peak experiences or NDEs is that we're actually wired physically for transcendent experiences.
Yes.
For the ineffable, right?
Yeah.
So how come we have got wiring, if we don't really recognize that we have that ability? You know, I mean, that's kind of like the disconnect that we're in our society right now, is that we've gone so far into very materialistic scientific view that we've lost sort of the mystic view. Yeah.
And it's interesting that you bring up the psilocybin studies, because there has been a large, overwhelming overtake of DMT studies over the last few years, and the association between DMT experience and near-death experience, the association between the two, and really kind of the idea that your pineal gland is there producing DMT, which is that God molecule that what our brain connects with the divine biochemically.
Yeah.
And the fact that it may be a DMT surge that happens toward the end. Now, did you come across any of that in your research or anything like that? Did you look into any of the DMT studies?
Oh, just a little bit.
They're still fully ongoing.
Oh, my gosh, yeah. And I have to say, over the COVID period, even more stuff has been published and coming out.
Yep.
It's almost like, since a lot of face-to-face research kind of stepped aside, all this data was coming out and, actually being published and listened to in a way that I think if the world hadn't quite stopped, we wouldn't have heard,
Yeah, and especially when it comes to the use of hallucinogens and the use of hallucinogens in a therapeutic atmosphere.
That's right.
There has been a really, really big turnaround academically with the idea, especially of psilocybin and other indigens, other things that are used by indigenous people, whether it be ibogaine, that's another big one that has come out, ibogaine and ketamine use as far as withdrawal symptoms and getting people off of drugs.
Yeah.
We used to have a gentleman on the show regularly who helped run an ibogaine clinic in Mexico. And I'm not sure if he's passed, actually. I have not been able to get a hold of him in the last year. But just to hear the work that was coming out on that, was phenomenal. And that is, once again, a source from Africa, from indigenous African roots and plants.
Right.
That was very much along the same lines as ayahuasca, where the tribal elders were told by spirits how to make this, how to mix these plants together. Where, unless you were some biochemist from Harvard out there knowing what compounds lied within things. And
they would never have known what is held in a lot of shamanic cultures. It's really fascinating, and I love all of this, and I've done so much research around that. But I do have to say that in my films, my audience has been for people. I think of my brothers who don't think about things like this.
Sure.
One brother is like, well, yeah, I believe in an afterlife. And the other one is like, no, end of the road. You died, done, finished, done. I'm like, well, let's open that conversation up a little bit more. So I really tried to make and do make films in this series that are to have the conversation, to give people enough information to start having their own conversation. So I'm not trying to tell people what they should think, because I respect other people's points of view. But in my own research, and more of this will come out in our website, I went a lot farther with, into this world, which I find so interesting, the NDE world and the spiritually transformative experiences. And because it says to me that we are so much more than we think we are.
Yeah.
And I think, to me, if you realize that, and, I'm really interested here at the conference to look into the pre-birth memories. It's like, well, that's really interesting stuff, right?
Sarah Hines was our previous interview just before you, and the concept of precognitive dreams about babies forthcoming, things like that.
Yeah, a lot of mothers have those kinds of dreams,
Absolutely.
Which is fascinating.
And even going to the International Remote Viewing Association, talking with people like Jeffrey Mishlev, other folks, Hal Putoff, having breakfast with him, things like that.
Yeah.
And seeing the fact that every single one of the people that was involved with the founding of the research of this is a PhD holder.
Oh, yeah.
And not like Mr. Mishlov, where it's like he is the only parapsychology PhD holder. Like, these are like particle physicists.
Yes.
And things like that. So it should not be strange to us. And it's only now that science has really started to turn the eye. And like it says right here on the back, does consciousness continue after death, or is it lights out? You do not have to get into the concept of a soul. You do not have to, like your dear brother, be very consternized with the fact that, this is a religious thing or it's not a religious thing. It has nothing to do with that.
That's right.
The question is, does your consciousness survive? Does you, as we intrinsically know it, survive? And what can we do to prove that?
Right.
And that's exactly what the big sponsorship and the grants and everything are about right now, is what can we do to quantifiably prove that this is the case. We have overwhelming substantive evidence from case study, everything else.
Oh, absolutely.
Personal account.
Yeah.
All that kind of stuff.
Oh, gosh. And really, stories of near-death experiences go back practically to the beginning of written time.
Absolutely.
So it really isn't a new thing. And as they say, when similar stories repeat over and over again, well, maybe you can't prove it in a lab, but it's probably true.
Well, and it's interesting because that's what Robert Bigelow was saying earlier today, because somebody asked via distance if, these had to be like full-on scientific quadruple blind studies. And he was like, unfortunately, a lot of this does not apply to general scientific theory and general scientific application.
Right. Not
that there has not been volumes of work done, even pre-1900s, in the beginnings of science as we know it. Like literally right where we came out of the point of illnesses caused by vapors to knowing what a bacterium is.
Right.
Late 1800s.
Right.
People were at the same time trying to find out if mass disappeared when you died. Things like that. There were all sorts of studies going on by as they were saying, people who even had Nobel Prizes. So the fact that this research now is kind of anathema to some scientists, to me, is odd. I'm one of those that I think by definition science is not static.
Exactly.
The day science is static, we really need to worry, because now we're talking a new religion.
Well, it's true. It is threatening, particularly as someone pointed out to me at the university level, where you've had a professor teaching the same course year after year after year, same textbooks, same everything.
Literally written the textbook used by most universities.
Absolutely. Royalty. And then it's like, you want me to include this new research?
Yeah. Means
he's got to rewrite his course curriculum.
Yeah.
Well, I'm, going to retire in a couple of years, and I don't want to do that. I've been doing just fine. So there's, I'm being really crude here. There is that element, but there's also just the threatening to the worldview. But I already figured it out when I was 29.
Yeah.
So I don't want to figure it out again.
There is that definite when it comes to academia.
Yeah.
It's hard because you're writing grants, you're looking for funding, for money, for proposals.
Right. That's right.
And unless it's something that will lead to a patent in the name of the university or a patent to the laboratory that you're working for and lead to some kind of end result that can be patented or money be made off of it.
Sure.
The research may or may not get funded. And to know that people like the Bigelow Institute and BICS are out there doing that.
It's fantastic.
And funding it to the tune of, like they were showing up on there, like $12,000, $50,000 grants.
Yep.
Into the millions this money is going to go.
Yeah.
And what do you see coming out of that as somebody who's been so entrenched in this study over the last few years, making these movies, things like that? Now that there are things like that, now that there are things like Bigelow Institute putting some money behind stuff, do you think that we will see anything on the horizon in the next few years?
Well, what I really think is that the generation that are in universities now and coming up into universities will have different opportunities to study and pursue research that will change a world perspective. And I think it makes the world a bigger place. It makes human experience a bigger experience. And I think, to just bring it home to where the world is right now, which is, a death-defying world in chaos and, mass murders and COVID
Tide Pod
wars
challenges.
But it's crazy, right? Really, the world is aflame.
Yeah.
And
the quickening, as Art Bell would say.
And I think part of it is, to be bold, is say it's a spiritual crisis because we don't know who we are anymore.
Oh, absolutely.
So you fucked up my life, No, you didn't.
Yeah.
You didn't.
And that's just it. We have been societally, especially on this side of the world, pushed into such an us versus them mentality that we have lost that gentle art of conversation.
Yes.
And it has become, how can I convince you of my paradigm?
Yeah.
And that my paradigm is true in the way.
Yeah.
When really, I should want to know everybody's paradigm in this room.
Yeah.
And not want to change it.
Yep. That's right.
I should just want to know and understand it so that I better understand myself and my journey inside of it.
That's right. That's right.
And we've lost that. It became this society of either I'm right and you're wrong, or it's us versus them, or the people who wear that color think this way.
Yeah.
It's very... The term I use on this show is a distillation mentality. And you end up with a lot of volatile things through distillation, through a distillation process.
Yeah.
You end up with things that are very polarized instead of there's something to be said about something being a little bit murky, and about there being a gray area. There's a million shades of gray between black and white. Feel free to go back and watch a black and white TV. There's a lot of shades in there. It's not just two colors, Like, that's the prime example.
Absolutely.
There are only two things there, and it's shades. There aren't even colors.
Right.
And even within that, there's a million tones
Yes.
of shade.
Yeah.
So you have to be ready for that reality, and you really
That's
do have to
right.
be ready for
That's
the fact
right.
that the
That's
world
right.
is bigger than just you.
Well, yeah, and honestly, our reality, my reality, is something that I have created.
Yeah.
That I believe in.
Absolutely.
So if I recognize that I created it, then it means that, well, you created yours,
Yeah.
right? And so, well, what's that about? It's not about, me versus you, like you're saying. It's
no.
not that polarity. It's more about, what do you know? If we create that world, then maybe we could create a world together that looked a little different, that we could agree on.
That's right. I made a post on somebody's Facebook timeline today who's a guest who was asking if love was an imperative or a choice at all. Can you choose to unlove somebody? I was like, absolutely. Love in and of itself is a choice. You are not forced or coerced into love. You willingly choose to love or not love. So, you create that situation for yourself. It may be an unhealthy way that you've created it because of the structures that you have socially been given and what have been associated with love, that four-letter word in your life from, the hierarchical members of your family, your mother, your father. Did they give you a good example of love? Like the Dalai Lama said, the first person that taught me compassion was my mother. She was my model for compassion, not anybody else. Unfortunately, we are all broken beings. We don't all come from the most amazing background. It is what we choose to do with what we are given.
That's right. It doesn't define you.
Yeah.
You define yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah. Although I think that the thing about love is that it's whether we open to it or not. Because I actually do believe that in the way that Martin Luther King did, that love isn't an anemic, saccharine kind of love, nor is it an aggressive love. That there's this kind of love force, like a field, and some people who've had near-death experiences or these, transcendent experiences talk about that there's an all-pervasive kind of love experience. And I think that, I was talking to Dean Radin about this, and he was saying, maybe really consciousness is this ground consciousness of which everything arises from and then goes back to.
A carrier signal, so to speak.
That's right. That's right.
A baseline carrier.
Yeah. Or the soup, whatever.
Yeah.
And so from that point of view, if consciousness is love, this kind of fundamental, elemental kind of love, then we're either opening into it or not. And that's a choice. Yeah. And that's a choice.
Precisely.
And that's okay.
And even, to quote Rush, even choosing not to decide is a choice.
That's exactly right.
You've made a choice by choosing not to participate.
Which is pretty much what a lot of people do. Yeah.
Which is okay. Yes. And I understand that. Once again, we in the West have this different idea. Even when it comes to love, we have lost the differentiation between agape love and romantic love.
Yes.
The love of brother, the love of fellow man, and romantic, intimate love. I have no problem telling one of my good male friends before I leave, like, I love you, man. I'll see you soon.
Yeah.
And giving him a hug, giving him a kiss even. I got no problem with that.
Yeah.
And for some reason, we tend to muddle these things. We tend to really, really muddy the waters and kick up a lot of silt when it comes to it. Now, we have you for a few more minutes. Let's focus a little bit on the movie again.
Okay. So number one, in the realm of death and dreaming.
Yes.
Number two, saying goodbye, preparing for death. this one in the realm, consciousness, is fundamental to the second one, saying goodbye, preparing for death. It matters what you think happens after you die.
Sure.
How you want to die. So normalizing the conversation around death, embracing our humanity. How do we talk about that? How do we share a conversation? Like you and I have just had an amazing conversation about a whole bunch of things.
Yeah.
But my brothers don't know how to talk about these things,
Yeah.
And they need to sort of open up a little more. So saying goodbye, preparing for death is really about having the conversation, knowing when to listen and letting someone talk to you.
Yeah.
And also, just sharing your mystery about the whole thing. So it's number 2. Number 3, which is coming out next year, is The Architecture of Death. And that is the inner world of dying. So it is the weeks and days and hours and moments leading up to death. And that's when, it's sort of like this question about consciousness comes full circle, because then you can have shared death experiences or premonitions of someone dying or a whole host of experiences. But you don't want to wait till someone's on their deathbed to talk about what they want.
Yeah.
It's like, don't play Stairway to Heaven when I'm dying.
Yeah.
I will kill you.
Yeah.
Right? You're going to mess up my death.
My wife already knows that. No Zeppelin.
But yeah. So that's kind of the trilogy overview, and the When You Die project, whenyouDie.org. Lots of material there on the site, lots of resources, and you can find us on all the social media platforms.
Such an important resource out there, especially nowadays in our society. We like you said earlier, we are at a spiritual loss. It seems. And that's not to say that we have lost spirituality. We're just lost.
Yeah.
We are, as of 2012, in a whole new cosmic cycle, which was the whole thing behind the Mayan prophecy, was that, hey, you're moving from day into night. You've had the daytime revelation of this technology or revelation. Now comes the nighttime application. Right. And that's what we're in right now. We have had a huge mass of technology and knowledge and everything dumped onto humanity. And we really do have to focus like a laser now, not like a shotgun, and focus that energy on what do we do with this now.
Right.
And knowing things like what we know with quantum physics, quantum mechanics, even the concept of manifestation within reality, and the fact that we are in control over much more than we think. Is a whole new concept for us here in the West. And I think things like what you're doing are a huge step to us understanding that and to understanding our place within it. So thank you so much for all the work that you've done with this. I look forward to, we will be having a screening of this.
Yes.
While we're here.
I have to tell you, my husband just saw it yesterday for the first time, and he lives with me.
Oh, wow.
So it's a sneak preview, and I'm terrified to see what people say.
I like your style, because I release albums and my wife is like, when did you write that? Like, when did you have time for that? And I'm like, I threw a little something together over a weekend, stuff like that. So the fact that your husband hadn't even seen it till recently, that's awesome. So once again, before we let you go, let everybody know where they can go to sign up for the mailing list, where they can go to follow your continued work, where they can go to see In the Realm of Dream, Death and Dreaming, where they can go to see the upcoming Saying Goodbye, Preparing for Death, and more.
And more. whenyouDie.org.
All right. There you have it. While you're online checking out everything from whenyouDie.org, make sure to stop on by CuriousRealm.com. That is the home for all of our episodes. That's the home for all of our guests, our books in the bookstore, all that kind of good stuff. Stay tuned for our continuing coverage of the International Association of Near-Death Studies 2022 conference here in Salt Lake City, Utah. We'll be right back with more authors, researchers, and more right after this, folks.